I think part of execution is, you do need to have that vision. You do need to have a personality and a leadership and an inspiration that will go across the team. But it needs to have a line drawn in the sand to where that inspiration and vision doesn't become, as you kind of indicated, overpowering to where the team doesn't have a voice, doesn't have courage, doesn't have anything, or the customers don't have a voice or courage.
Welcome to the How to Not Execute Your Strategy podcast. I'm your host, Tim Ojai. This podcast is dedicated to the biggest lessons learned from the people who own strategic execution, the senior leaders who live in the center of it. My guest today is Tom Pisello, also known as the ROI Guy. See the show notes for more information about Tom and to also get the leader guide for this episode. Let's get to it. Tom, it is so great to have you on the show today, and I'm super excited that we get to talk, especially with you, because your background, I mean, you currently run your own company, but you've been the C-level guy, you've been the CEO of a couple of different companies that you've built and grown and sold and then moved to start. So I expect our conversation is going to go in some wildly interesting places. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Thanks so much, Tim, for having me.
All right, so let's dive in. The first question I always ask everybody is, tell me about a time when you had a strategy that did not go as planned, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, I've got a few to choose from. One that comes to mind is one that cost me a lot of money and time. Two things that, in particular, at the time, that are really hard to get back. So I had this business had been running great for a while. We had a pretty established product line, and I really wanted to innovate. And I love to be innovative. I'm a product guy at heart. So, I love to model myself after Steve Jobs and Jeffrey Moore and, kind of that kind of product ilk. And so I had this idea I practice in the value selling and marketing space. And in value selling, I had this idea, and this was right when an iPad was becoming popular for sellers to start to use in engagements. So what if we could have the iPad and a seller sit next to a buyer and walk them through a little back of the napkin story about the value of the solution, and have literally back of the napkin calculators to calculate the value. Sounds pretty good, Tim, right?
I've literally done this with customers, and we're sitting there on a napkin. I mean,
so this was a virtual napkin on the new iPad, and at the time, a lot of sales forces were buying iPads for everyone. It was just in vogue to do that. And so we started to develop the application, and it came along really well, and it looked great. I mean, literally, you would go like this, and the napkin would flip, and there'd be like an animated
napkin
on. It was an actual napkin on the iPad.
Oh my gosh, it's so fun.
Tim, it would draw the story of the value, and then you'd flip the napkin, and then there'd be like a calculator, and it looked like handwriting. And so you'd kind of write in the numbers, or you'd type in the numbers as you're going through it, and it would calculate it. And then you go to the next one, and it would be a story, and it had great navigation. So the product seemed like, man, what a winner, right? Couple of issues. We didn't really develop the product for one of our existing customers, which would have been great. Now, not that we didn't preview the product for them or anything else, but I kind of took this attitude like, I'm innovative. I know what the market wants. I can be just like Steve Jobs too.
Yeah, I'll tell you what you need.
Dictate to the market, hey, here's a great product. And like we're saying, it sounds great. It looked great. It felt great. But what we started to run into were a couple of issues of adoption that you normally run into, which is, you could have some sellers within these organizations that were armed with iPads, but not everyone had an iPad. Mm-hmm. And we unfortunately went out with just an iPad dedicated solution. And then what other ones, maybe they needed to have it on the desktop or needed to have it on the web, and it just didn't work for that. So we started to run into these very practical constraints that some of the customers had or requirements that they needed in order to have this be effective for them. And it just killed overall the adoption. But the challenge was we kind of spent a year doing the development. This is a time that was a little bit different than today, where development is a lot shorter. But thinking back then, it was pretty rapid development. It was production ready, so the whole thing was like buttoned up and ready to go. And we did a road show, so we had events in different cities and got
Wow.
good attendance at all of that. But we just couldn't make the sale. And a couple of $1 million later, a whole year worth of
Oh,
effort,
wow.
plus maybe another 6 months or a year before we figured out that it just had so many limitations and wasn't going to be able to kind of recover from that. And when you've got a relatively small company, those things are serious. A couple of $1 million and a year and a half, 2 years worth of development, I'll take the wind out of the sails. And you don't have a lot of runway to not get things right away. If it's a bigger company, shit, you do experiments like this all the time. So there's
Right.
innovative groups, right? But when it's a small company, you got to get it right.
You were all in.
So
So let me slow you down
yeah,
here. In From the point you officially launched, the first date of like we're now public, how quickly did you start getting feedback that it wasn't on target?
pretty.
Immediately,
And
pretty
even
early.
in the road shows, we were getting feedback like, "Oh, this thing looks great, looks dynamite, but what about this? What about that? What
Mm.
about?" Sometimes you can overcome that by finding early adopters that don't care about not having all of those features, right? So
Were you overly reliant on those early adopters, do you think, looking back?
we were not. And in fact, I think we were the opposite. We didn't
Mm.
have those early adopters that co-created the solution with us, Tim. And that's the big lesson that I learned in this was like, look, I'm pretty smart and I know I can create an incredible looking product and everything else, but is it going to be a successful product or not? I think the
Yeah, yeah.
only way to do that is co-create with some of your key early adopter innovative type customers. And if we would have done that, we probably wouldn't have developed the exact solution that we had come up with. It would not have been tied to the iPad, for one example, and been optimized for that environment. It would have been a little bit more generic and
It's
might not have had those limitations that ultimately became the strength of it, because it was this incredibly sexy back of the napkin iPad app with drawing and everything else. It
a
it's
situation
a good
where your vision overtook your ability to see.
yes, completely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And was it your strategy or was it your team's strategy? Did you have a bunch
It
of people
was
all
my
bought in?
strategy. I'll
Ah,
fall on that sword. Yeah. So a lot of
okay.
ego, a lot of pride in it, and probably that kept it going longer than it should. We probably should have recognized some of these things earlier. And yeah, so that's a mistake I will never make again.
Yeah, right.
Knock on.
Exactly. That's a beautiful thing about this whole podcast about the stories, mistakes you've made, and then like I learned and I don't do it anymore. I've had a number of other guests talk about how courage that's critical. Did your team have that courage? Were they missing that courage? Was it just something that they just like, no, we're just going to trust Tom and Tom knows because it's Tom Pisello. I mean, he's the ROI guy. He's
Yeah, part of having that cult of personality and like that persona is that it's very powerful from a market standpoint, but it can also be kind of quieting on an internal standpoint, to where maybe the organization was recognizing some of these challenges and perhaps didn't have the courage to stand up because of that persona. Because,
Mm,
hey, Tom's got to know what's right here or what's not. So there were a couple of salespeople I had who've been with me for a long time. One was an
sure.
IBM veteran that was with me, gosh, almost 30 years. Betty was with me. She recognized pretty early, like she was able to get us the meetings and start to have the dialogue and start to realize where, you know, these platform requirements were not going to be met, and that
Mm,
we really weren't going to be able to sell this kind of by
mm.
itself, without overcoming some of those requirement issues.
How long was she kind of raising that? Because it sounds like she did ring the bell.
Yeah, she did raise those issues. I'm trying to remember it. I mean, it's a while ago.
Sure,
But
sure.
I think 6 months of
Yeah.
just saying, no, it'll come along. And don't forget, when those iPads kind of apps were first released, I think all of us were thinking, okay, this is all you're going to use. It's like,
Hmm.
why should salespeople
Yeah.
walk in with the laptop or anything else anymore? The market will come to us, kind of thing, was something that I was touting, I think, a little bit too much, and maybe not listening as much as we should. So it was kind of an all bets in on a platform that probably we should have been more conservative about, especially because of the stage of the company that we were at.
Well, yeah, you have the
Yeah.
sunk cost, all of that. But where does that go to your
Yeah.
personal? You talked about money and all that and time, but now personally, what was going on inside of you and how did that affect you?
Yeah, it definitely knocked me down a number of pegs. Here
Mm,
I am thinking, oh, I'm as smart as like Steve Jobs who could do this. There are very few people I think that have that vision. And I think even with those people that have the vision, if you don't have all of the resources and everything else around it, you're never going to get there. So,
yeah,
if Steve
yeah.
Jobs was at a different company or didn't have the resources, would he have gotten? Yeah,
Colossal failure with the company next that was going to be his thing. It was going to be better than Apple, and it failed miserably.
exactly.
I remember one of the top angel investors in Silicon Valley once told me, "Look, Tim, look, ideas are worth a buck. All the money's in the execution."
Yeah.
Which is why we're doing this podcast. But the idea though is that you can have all the inspiration on the idea, but if you can't get it to get legs, and the thing I'm hearing is the legs you planned are not necessarily the legs you're going to need. And if you
Mhm.
don't create that capacity, you're not going to execute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that, for me, I'm still a creative. I still love to create, to write, to, whether it be a poem or a book or anything. And so I've learned to, from a personal standpoint, have other creative outlets, music being one of them, and
Hmm.
not have it necessarily be in the execution of my business, because I think I used that as my creative outlet and got
Oh,
way over my
interesting.
skis as a result. Yeah.
Have you
And
seen this
so,
pattern amongst other creatives? Other creative leaders have the tendency to kind of do the same thing. They use their creative energy in the execution rather than just releasing it, letting people kind of play jazz with it. And you can just
yeah,
say, hey, how's it going?
yeah, I
Uh,
completely agree with
any other big lessons from that experience you want to share?
that. Just make sure that now I always sell first and kind of develop and deliver second, rather than develop first and then sell second. So definitely co-creating with your best customers is the way to do it. And I wouldn't approach any kind of product development any other way anymore, especially for earlier stage or even mid-stage companies. As smart as you think you are or you think your team is, that co-creation and collaboration need to occur.
Beautiful. That's a great launch pad into the next part. Next question is what are 2 or 3 attributes everybody in the organization needs to have in order to execute really well? You just talked about co-creation and collaboration. Do you want to put those on your list or do you want to pull a couple others?
I think those definitely need to be on the list. I think the other challenge that I had, just being self-reflective on it, is ego. You know,
Mm,
it got in the way. And
mm,
whether that was thinking that we could define a market completely, and shape it a certain way, to, in the end, just continuing to, you know, the sunk cost bias of not pulling the plug. I think part of execution is, you do need to have that vision. You do need to have a personality and a leadership and an inspiration that will go across the team. But it needs to have a line drawn in the sand to where that inspiration and vision doesn't become, as you kind of indicated, overpowering to where the team doesn't have a voice, doesn't have courage, doesn't have anything, or the customers don't have a voice or courage.
I think it's huge. So I want to camp on this for a bit because there are so many situations where frankly, I had a guest from this season talk about how that was pushed out of him, the ability to challenge, because one of his big lessons, you got to trust your gut. And if you can't trust your gut, in Hawaiian, we talk about your na'au. If you don't listen to that voice inside of you and trust it, it's going to take you into places you don't have any business being. And that in a corporate environment, especially for those in the audience you're not the head of your company, you're not the solopreneur or the entrepreneur driving a small team, you're larger, you've got politics, you've got all this other stuff going on, that voice gets silenced. And especially if you now add in, you have a leader who's charismatic, visionary, who's got a great track record of success. What do those people need in order to harmonize and balance the energy that you want those great creative visionaries to bring, but you don't all want it to be overpowered? What do they need in order to balance that out?
Hey, if you're enjoying this conversation, I want to encourage you to go to timohai.com/blog now and get the leader guide. It's an awesome way to allow me to both coach you personally through deeper reflection and to also open up the dialogue with your team. All right, back to the interview.
Yeah, they need strong, detail-oriented voices and executors around them. Definitely. And they
What does
need
that
to
look
stay
like?
here. Yeah. That if you've got someone who's that creative and that inspiration, you've got to have really diligent doers, people that are going to go and take care of all the details, because a lot of times those aren't detail-oriented people.
Yeah.
And then second, you've got to have challengers and dissenters and let them have a voice on the team. And that's not easy to do, because usually that inspirational person has a big personality. They've got a persona. Like, I've created
Yeah.
a business persona. And a lot of times it's easy for that to be overwhelming for people that are around, or that you just have characteristics that are the very old style kind of characteristics, like the Bill Gates jumping on the table kind of aspect, or the Steve Ballmer up on stage kind of aspect of that old school kind of efforts in management. It's the era that I grew up in. I was up at Microsoft during that time.
Oh, yeah.
So you've got to kind of have it to where you're creating a culture where the vision and the inspiration are there, but you are letting the team, you're getting out of the way so the team can execute. You're still injecting the spirit and the energy in it, but you're not managing, you're not forcing, you're not doing those things. And it's a tough thing to balance. I don't think I've mastered that to this day at 59. So
It's really big. Let's this whole idea of how do you engineer the right, and the key is the right kind of resistance into your culture, because that's so I'll go back to kind of a change management principle that I advise and you've used for decades, and it's true. You've got a third, a third, and a third. Roughly a third of the group will jump in and just be in no matter what. They're just in. That's just who they are. They're already going in that direction, and what you're saying makes sense. And so they're like easy to jump into the boat and start paddling. You've got a third who's going to sit on the fence. They're going to sounds good, nod the head yes, but they're going to wait. And then you got a third who will fight you every step of the way. They're resistant. They don't want to be changed. They're like, look, my God, why are you doing this? And all the other different things. Sometimes there's a lot of legitimacy in there that needs to be heard, but it's such a loud negative voice, we tend to tune them out. So I always say, focus on getting your first third to convert your middle third. Get those fence sitters off. And all you're trying to do is get your resistance down to 20% or less. And it's amazing the math. If my resistance is 1 out of 5, even that person, even if they're toxic, they're going to pull one fence sitter with them, but it's still 3 against 2, and you'll get stuff done. If you go to 25%, 1 out of 4, they're going to pull that fence sitter with them. And now you got a 50-50 split, maybe worse, because you only have 1 out of those 4 is probably all in. And now you're stuck spinning. But at the same time, everybody wants to push to eliminate resistance. I see this all the time, especially in tech, but other companies where they're like, you got to drink the Kool-Aid. You got to be all in. This is our culture. And you're just not our culture if you just don't drink the Kool-Aid. And I'm like, you're
yeah,
removing independent thought.
the people that are resisting just disengage. and that's happened to me even at organizations before. And so totally get that. But it's hard. You don't like, when it's your baby and your idea and,
Yeah.
back of the
So
napkin is so elegant, you want everyone to agree with it.
so what are some of the things you've done in order to build um, that safe space, or that healthy space I prefer to use, that healthy space where challenge can be brought up? And then what are the rules for that? So it's okay to hear challenge, but if you're just going to vomit on the table, that's not helping anybody. It's just a mess to clean up.
And Tim, before we jump to that, one of the things I do want to say is we're living in like at the era of the naysayer right now.
Mm,
I think
mm,
um, you can anonymously, and even not anonymously, you see people in on sales calls all the time. You'll be doing a Zoom, and the chatter is going on in the background, all around what you're saying and presenting and doing. Slack is going off. So, and everyone kind of has a Monday morning quarterback, a toxic opinion in a lot of ways. And so there's definitely a culture, particularly in the younger generation, of likes and in particular dislikes and comments, and in some ways not exactly constructive. So
and
how do
I
you
will say, I think that's our cultural voice. I mean, I go back and forth between, is it a generational thing? Is it a cultural thing? But our culture has definitely gone to the point where you're encouraged
Mhm.
to drop a critical truth bomb, so to speak,
Yeah,
and to do it from a distance, not face to face to the person. And now it's become, to your point,
the
um,
issue.
eh, eh, it's become the topic rather than whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. Now it's about, how do you manage negativity and truth and get the right balance, instead of, well, what are we trying to do? Can we still accomplish that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I I think, and how I look at how to solve this, I need to look at some of the traits that have led to it not being great experiences. And one of those is slowing down,
What does
like
that mean?
dramatically. So, particularly for my kind of style, very fast thinker, very fast brain, very emotional brain, right? And one of the things that um been working on probably the most is just slow down, listen, seek input from every person. And even if they don't provide it, make sure that you've turned to them and given it to them. When someone gives you that feedback, mirror it back. Use a therapy technique called mirroring, which is
Mm,
basically, let me see if I understand what you're saying. And you literally will try to mirror back exactly what they said to you, or as close as possible. And you can sometimes shorthand it a little bit. And then you basically, when you do that, you say, is that correct? And if
mm,
they say, yes, great, then you say, tell me more to get deeper. Don't leave it at just the first answer. Or if it's not, you can basically get them to say, they'll basically say, no, here's what I meant to say, or you got all of this right, but here's three things that I need to clarify for you. So it's really taking the time. And when you think about the entrepreneurial mindset in
mm.
particular, and sometimes a creative mindset, like that creative flow that you get into, um, it can be the exact opposite of what you want to do, and what every bone in your body is screaming, which is fast, 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 go, go, go. Get on board. And it's the exact opposite. You've got to take the time. And that's very difficult for a lot of, I know it's been personally always difficult for me to make sure I'm making that time, to make sure I'm reaching out and getting everyone's input, to make sure that I'm doing the mirroring and
Mm,
not just saying, yeah, I heard what you said, but
mhm,
here's something more. No, that's not, this is the way. And instead making sure that everyone knows they've been heard. And once you're in an environment where everyone knows that they're heard, then that's when no one's going to be afraid to speak up, and you'll be able to hear the things that ultimately you need to hear to get it right, because that
yeah.
collective is always going to be better than just what you're thinking and just you by yourself.
100% agree. And I would add that I have heard, it's helped me a lot, is this idea that even the most toxic people, 10% of what they're saying is true. Find it. Find
Hmm.
it. Give yourself the time to draw it out, sort through all the crap, find the 10% truth, mirror that,
Hmm.
and all of a sudden the conversation can become this beautiful thing
Yeah.
because you're not disregarding the other stuff verbally. You're just putting the energy into the part that you're like, I agree with this, or I want to know more about this.
Yeah.
And
Tell
that
me
person
more.
feels heard, wants to share, will share. They may throw in the other stuff and you're gonna have to keep waddling through it. But the end of the day, um, having been on both sides of this discussion, there's so much truth in that 10% that if you don't catch it, it could be the thing that keeps you
Mhm.
from spending a year and a half and $1 million on something that shouldn't have been carried that far.
Exactly.
What else would you add to this list? And I kind of want to prime the pump here because I know you've done a lot of work around um, personal energy and growth, and we're both, for the audience, we're both widowers, and I've been on Tom's podcast and I'm in his book as a chapter in my own story. But what's going on inside our hearts and in our heads actually transcends this whole conversation. So would you go there for a little bit and talk about how that ties into how you execute it, and especially how you be the leader who can do this?
Yeah, there's a lot I learned through loss and grief. Lessons that were hard won. Um, Everything from gaining my sobriety, now 6 years sober,
Well done.
to um, to losing 60 pounds and getting myself in physical shape so that I can be there for my daughters. Um, so, on the personal growth standpoint, I think part of what I learned is we're never too old to learn, we're never too old to grow, and we're never too old to reinvent ourselves, because all of this happened for me when I was 53 is when the loss occurred. So, it's about 6 years ago. And I had to reprioritize things a lot. For me, it was always work, 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 work. And then all of a sudden, the illness comes along. And it was a
Yeah.
10-year roller coaster battle with cancer. First breast and then brain, uh, glioblastoma. And during that, I took some time off, turned the company reins over to someone else, but I'd still get back in and still, still work was still the primary. And
Mm,
what I found was that after the loss and after kind of re examining things, it wasn't as important. And I really felt like I needed to re explore my why. Why am I doing these things? Um, and what do I want to accomplish in life overall now that I'm in kind of that second half or last third of my life, depending on life expectancy. And so that's why I decided, Tim, to use some of that energy and experience and God-given gifts to create the book Growth Through Grief and do the podcast and some of those other things. And I'll tell you, it was part of the journey that I'm so glad I did, because I think I've grown so much from it, from business capability and retrospective and just some of the improvements that we spoke about, whether it be fitness or alcohol or faith. There were a lot of things that got reinvented and recaptured in my
mm,
life that I didn't have before. And I think we have to remember that we get so wrapped up in our identity being our business identity and our identity being work, work, work. And there's more to life than that. And family first, is definitely part of it.
that is so well said. That is so well said. I will say consistently, um, in my own coaching practice here, that I run into people all the time who define their identity by the strategy they're executing.
Yeah.
And I my friend, you are so much more than that. So Tom, thank you so much for sharing your journey, lessons from the front lines, including lessons from the medical tent, as well as just the continuing contribution you bring to both the business world and the personal one, and bringing them together so that we can truly be the best versions of ourselves when we show up to work, and then when we go home. It's been a joy.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening.
I hope you enjoyed that episode and have some solid takeaways. Here are 3 that I want to highlight. 1, beware the danger of allowing your vision to overshadow your ability to execute. If the energy of your big idea dominates the conversation, it can shove difficult topics like readiness and dependencies to the side. 2, sell first, develop and deliver second, not the other way around. You need that co-creation and collaboration with those customers to make sure that you are executing what will ultimately be adopted and valuable to your greater market. 3, you have to balance the energy of innovation with the autonomy that your teams need to make their own decisions. This is really hard to do because the tendency for visionary leaders is to kill one or the other. If you enjoyed this episode, there are 3 things that I would ask of you. First, please share it with at least one person. Second, hit those rating stars on whatever platform you downloaded this podcast. When you do that, it raises the visibility of what we are talking about to people just like you. Third, follow me on LinkedIn and Meta, especially on Instagram at Tim_Ohai. You'll get even more content that will both challenge and inspire you. Holomua. Onward and upward.